Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome back to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we continue our peaceful journey through England's worst kings in Part 3, exploring the most troubled reign that brought chaos and conflict to medieval England. In this episode, we'll softly discover the tragic stories of Richard II and Henry VI, from Richard's unexpected ascension as a 10-year-old child, through the challenges of the Peasants' Revolt and political upheaval, to Henry VI's struggles with mental illness, and the devastating wars of the Roses to King, whose reigns would forever change the course of English history. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which medieval monarch you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 14th and 15th centuries lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Richard, later known as King Richard II of England, entered this world on the 6th of January 1367 at the Archbishop's residence in the western French city of Bordeaux, within the English territory of Aquitaine. His father was Edward, Prince of Wales, the eldest son and chosen successor of King Edward III of England. The prince is better remembered by his famous title of the Black Prince, a designation he likely earned from the dark armor he frequently donned. Edward had proven himself in combat, defending his father's interests in France since his youth, participating in many crucial battles during the early phases of the 100 Years' War, which Edward III had begun in 1337 to assert his right to the French throne in acknowledgement of his service in France. Edward III had appointed his son and heir as Prince of Aquitaine and Gascony, the heart of England's French possessions, in 1362. Due to the Black Prince's extended periods in that region, Richard came to be born in western France. Because of his birthplace, he would later be called Richard of Bordeaux until his eventual coronation as King Richard II. Richard of Bordeaux's mother was Joan J., the Countess of Kent. She was the child of Edmund of Woodstock, the first Earl of Kent, and was herself the great-granddaughter of King Edward I, Edward III's grandfather. Therefore, the Black Prince, whom she wed in 1361 as her third spouse, was her relative. Joan was the elder of the two at 35 years, but their marriage quickly bore two sons, Edward, who was born at Angoulême in the summer of 1364, and Richard, who came 2.5 years afterward. Richard came into existence during a time when his family was embroiled in an immense conflict spanning much of Western Europe. In 1337, his grandfather, King Edward III, monarch of England, ruler of Wales, and lord of substantial portions of northern and western France, had begun asserting his claim to the French throne against King Philip VI of the House of Valois, who had ruled France since 1328. Edward's assertion led to the beginning of what historians call the 100 Years' War, a struggle between the Plantagenet monarchs of England and the Valois rulers of France for dominion over France. Though the conflict experienced periods of both intense fighting and relative calm across the 116 years it actually lasted, this was partly driven by Edward III already possessing significant territories in France, where he governed Aquitaine and Gascony in the western regions of the country and other districts in the north, such as the Pale of Calais. Furthermore, The Plantagenet domains extended westward across the Irish Sea, where an English lordship had been established in the eastern and southern portions of the island during the late 12th, 13th, and early 14th centuries. This Irish inheritance was often overlooked but would prove substantially important for Richard's future reign. Remarkably little is documented about Richard's earliest years, and the specifics of his education and upbringing during his infancy and early childhood remain largely mysterious, though we know that Sir Simon de Burgh, a companion of the Black Prince, instructed Richard for some time. If this phase of Richard's life appears somewhat unclear, it is because the chroniclers of that era were understandably more focused on examining the complex politics of these years and their consequences for the future monarch. The first major development occurred during the winter of 1370, when Richard had not yet reached his 4th birthday. At this time, his elder brother, Edward, was stricken by the bubonic plague, the deadly disease that had reached Europe earlier in the century. Transported by fleas on Asian rats, the Black Death, as the initial epidemic in the mid-14th century became known, had rapidly killed approximately 1/3 of Europe's population. Now the young prince, second in line to the throne after his father, was taken by it at some unknown date in late 1370, or possibly in January 1371. This meant that young Richard became his father's heir and second in line to the throne at a time when the reigning monarch, Edward III, was approaching his 60s and showing signs of rapidly declining health to make the succession problems worse. Richard's father, the Black Prince, was himself in poor health by the early 1370s. Despite his military excellence, Prince Edward had been ill for some time. This had begun during a military expedition into Spain in 1365 and 1366, just before Richard's birth. Many of Edward's soldiers had died of dysentery during the campaign, and the prince fell gravely ill himself. At the time, many suspected he had been poisoned. Whatever the truth of his ailment, he never fully recovered from it. Consequently, the death of the younger Edward in 1370 placed Richard closer to the throne than might otherwise have occurred. Then in June 1376, the Black Prince finally died from his illness. Measures were quickly taken to name Richard as the new Prince of Wales and the designated heir of Edward III. Parliament quickly confirmed this, as there was concern, which was probably groundless, that Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, would attempt to seize the throne if Edward III died while Richard was still so young. As a result, the so-called Good Parliament of 1376 formally recognized Richard as Edward's successor, so that when the old king died on the 21st of June 1377, Richard inherited the crown. A minority government would now be required. Richard could not rule independently as a 10-year-old, and it would be several years before he could begin to exercise kingship meaningfully. Therefore, a council of courtiers and officials was formed to effectively govern England and the other territories of the realm during Richard's minority. However, this minority government was somewhat powerless, as a decision was made to limit the authority of the king's uncles, a choice which divided the government of the realm. 3 of Richard's uncles had survived their father. Of these, John of Gaunt was the most important. He was born in the Low Countries in 1340, and his name came from a corruption of the word Ghent, the town where he was born. He was the eldest of Edward III's surviving sons when Richard ascended to the throne in 1377, and as such he had a claim to authority within the royal family during his nephew's minority. Moreover, he had campaigned extensively on the continent during the 100 Years' War, both in France and Spain, and was therefore completely familiar with military matters and the complex politics of Western Europe in the late 14th century. Beyond, John Edward III's fifth son, Thomas of Woodstock, Earl of Buckingham and future Duke of Gloucester, would also play a significant role in future events. Richard was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 16th of July, 1377. There were great expectations for the new king, while Edward III had been one of England's greatest monarchs and had reinforced the English presence in France. The final years of his long reign had witnessed several problems develop in the realm and resentment growing over large taxes and the control of the court by a faction surrounding the late king's mistress, Alice Purr. Therefore, Richard's accession was welcomed as a possibility for a fresh beginning in England. But these hopes were quickly disappointed. The heavy taxes which Edward III's administration had been forced to impose in England to fund the war in France continued in the form of the poll tax, a levy of 4 pence per person. Though it was initially charged in 1377 only on a select group of people in England who could afford it. Additionally, 2 members of the King's Council, Sir Simon de Burghley and Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford, began to concentrate power in their own hands and clashed with Parliament in such a way that by 1380, the minority councils were largely abandoned. All of this ensured that by the time Richard was entering his teenage years in 1380 and 1381, his government was already increasingly unpopular, even as Richard began to rule as king himself. Most troubling of all in the late 1370s and early 1380s was that the war effort was going very poorly. It was one thing for England's nobility and broader political community to be heavily taxed at home, but it was doubly concerning to see that those same taxes were enabling nothing but defeat on the continent. Between 1377 and 1380, English forces suffered several defeats against French armies led by the Breton knight and constable of France, Bertrand du Guesclin. By the time du Guesclin and King Charles V of France both died in 1380, the French had reclaimed most of the lands which Edward III had gained in the country under the terms of the Treaty of Brittany in 1360, and the English presence was largely limited to Calais and some other port town. Then the decision by the French government in Paris to attempt to bind the Duchy of Brittany to the French crown in 1380 created an opportunity for the English to realign themselves with the duchy, but even this ended in defeat. Richard's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, led an army to France in 1380 to try to take advantage of this situation. But in the months that followed, the government of Charles VI, the new French king, and himself, a child like Richard, reconciled with the Breton, and Thomas consequently found himself stranded in northwest France with an army that was suffering heavy casualties. The only saving grace was that the king's uncle was able to secure a payment of 50,000 francs from the Bretons in exchange for abandoning his campaign. Nevertheless, the war effort appeared grim during Richard's first years. Given all these problems, it is unsurprising that Richard's early reign is notable for 2 major instances of civil and religious unrest in England. The first of these concerned the teachings of the theologian and philosopher John Wycliffe, and the following he acquired in the late 1370s and early 1380s Wycliffe was born sometime in the 1320s and had attended the University of Oxford in the 1350s, before subsequently acquiring a teaching position there and eventually becoming master of Balliol College. Thereafter, he acquired several positions within the church, while also continuing his teaching work periodically. By the last years of King Edward III's reign, he was engaged in a project to translate the Bible into English from Latin. By the time Richard ascended to the throne in 1377, he had become a figure of some controversy, as he began to call for a striking series of reforms to be initiated in the English Church. These anticipated much of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, calling for a removal of ostentation from churches, a closer reading of Scripture in the vernacular languages, and a wariness of residual elements of pagan superstition in popular religious practice. More significantly, he questioned many aspects of church belief, including the power of the papacy in Rome, the relative doctrinal merit of some of the sacraments, and the veneration of the saints. Wycliffe really began to become a problem from a political perspective in England in the first months of Richard's reign. At that time, he published De Civili Dominio, or On Civil Dominion, a work which called for a separation of church and state, and which criticized the power of the papacy in Rome, earning Wycliffe his first official condemnation from Pope Gregory. In contrast to the vast riches and power of the Roman Catholic Church, Wycliffe argued that the Church should renounce its wealth and priests should live in poverty. Thereafter, he clashed repeatedly with the church authorities in England and intensified his attacks on the Pope. His doctrinal discussion expanded at this time, and by the end of the 1370s, Wycliffe was questioning the concept of transubstantiation, the idea that Christ is present in the Eucharist. It was not simply that he was a lone voice. By the early 1380s, Wycliffe had amassed a large following of priests and laypeople who believed in his ideas, some within the ranks of government and the court. Today, these are known as the Lollards, though the term was a derogatory one which was applied by opponents of Wycliffe's teachings in subsequent times. As a result of all this, Wycliffe began to lose the support of many within the church and government, notably over his rejection of transubstantiation. By the early 1380s, England was experiencing considerable unrest owing to Wycliffe's teachings and the response of the church and Richard's government to them. One of the major issues here was the manner in which Wycliffe's teachings essentially argued for a society stripped of its traditional hierarchies of state and church. It was no simple matter to silence him. By 1382, he had amassed a very considerable contingent of followers within government circles, and the English Parliament and Oxford had become the intellectual center of the Lollard movement in England. Where the movement may have gone in future years, had he lived longer, is a matter of some interest, but Wycliffe was not long for the world. On the 28th of December, 1384, efforts to suppress the Lollard were accordingly being implemented occasionally during the 1380s and 1390s, and indeed well into the 15th century. Anti-Wycliffe legislation was still being introduced into England. In time, Wycliffe's teaching influenced the church reform movement on the continent and was a very significant precursor to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Wycliffe's movement also played a part in causing the other major social and political crisis of the early part of Richard's reign, the demographic and economic changes which had been caused by the Black Death in the 1340s and 1350s had led to long-lasting tensions between landholders in England and the peasantry. This was exacerbated by Wycliffe's teachings, which appealed to the lower orders and the poor. Then in 1381, the poll tax, which had previously been imposed only on the more well-off in England, was expanded to be collected from all adults, even the poor, a move which led to widespread unrest and then rebellion. The peasants' revolts of 1381 started in Kent and Essex in the early summer, when large bands of armed peasants gathered at Blackheath near London. They were led by Wat Tyler, John Ball, and Jack Straw, Tyler being a tradesman who had led a contingent of the disaffected from Canterbury towards London, and Ball being a radical preacher who had been imprisoned and who mirrored the egalitarianism of Wycliffe's preaching, albeit while not being an acknowledged follower of Wycliffe's. In the days that followed their congregation at Blackheath, the peasant army murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the Lord High Treasurer of England, Robert Hales, as well as burning down John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace. A major crisis now ensued across southern England. Richard's government had been caught off guard by the sudden advance of the peasant army under Tyler and Ball towards London. The king was quickly moved to the Tower of London, the central military fortress in late medieval London. Here, the government convened around the 14-year-old king and deliberated on negotiating with the rebels. But this seemed impossible. Their demands were utopian for the time and extended as far as the complete abolition of serfdom, as well as an abandonment of the poll tax and reform of the church. By now, the rebels were effectively swarming around London, and there was little option but for Richard and his counselors to meet with Tyler and his subleader. Meetings occurred at Mile End and Smithfield, outside London, on the 14th and the 15th of June. But the second meeting broke into a confrontation when Tyler refused to show adequate deference in front of the king. A melee broke out, and in the ensuing fighting Tyler was killed by William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London. Thereafter, Richard granted clemency to the rebels on condition that they would disperse, a promise which was later revoked. With the rebellion having lost its drive, the king was consequently able to mop up the last elements of unrest in Essex. By the end of June 1381, the peasants' revolt of 1381 was a watershed moment in Richard's reign. Prior to this, we know little about the king himself, on either his education, his childhood, or his role, however small it might have been, in ruling England between 1377 and 1381. However, we first begin to see him at the center of events in the chronicles and histories of the time during the summer of 1381, as he met with Tyler and his associates and campaigned actively in the field. Much of this information for Richard's reign comes from the works of Thomas Walsingham, a contemporary of these events, who was probably born in the mid-14th century. He subsequently became a Benedictine monk and spent much of his life at the monastery of St. Albans Abbey in Hertfordshire. Here he was in charge of the scriptorium and is believed to have been the author of several key histories of the period, including the Chronica Majora, which details much of the earlier part of Richard's reign during his minority, and the Historia Anglicana, which provided a history of England between 1272 and 1422, the year of Walsingham's own death. Other important sources of information on Richard's reign include the Chronicles of Jean Froissart, a contemporary observer of events from France, and the anonymously authored Dulicher's Chronicle, which presents extensive details about Richard's later life. From these authors, we get a relatively coherent picture of the king who began to emerge from boyhood in the 1380s. Almost all contemporaries, even the chroniclers, who were generally opposed to Richard's rule, unanimously agreed that Richard was a handsome monarch, standing just over 6 feet tall and with an athletic build, depicts him with reddish hair, and he is known to have sported a beard. He was well-read and keenly intelligent, while his religious views were conservative, and he became implacably opposed to the Lollards later in his reign. But there were other aspects of his personality which were more problematic. As he became older, Richard became increasingly autocratic, with a tendency towards being an absolutist monarch. Long before absolutist monarchy emerged as a prevailing political orthodoxy amongst Europe's royal families in the 16th and 17th century, there were also psychological issues. Richard could behave strangely in his adult years, to the extent that earlier biographers have suggested he may have suffered from schizophrenia, while one of the most in-depth recent studies of his rule concluded that Richard was possessed of what today would be termed a narcissistic personality disorder. The ill effects of these personality defects would, however, not begin to manifest themselves for some time to come. Back in the early 1380s, in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, there were pressing issues. The nation was in a poor state. There was little denying that. The war in France had seen many defeats in recent years. The common people of the country were extremely disaffected owing to high taxation, and there was religious heresy proliferating throughout the country. These issues would take time to amend. But one thing which could be dealt with more easily was the issue of Richard's marriage. By 1381, he was 14, and a wife was being actively sought for the young king so that he could begin suring heirs to continue the royal line. The match that was eventually negotiated was with Anne of Bohemia, the eldest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Luxembourg and Bohemia. Charles IV. Charles was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, and the marriage alliance was formed on the basis that he would ally with England against the French in the years to come. This latter belief, though, proved unfounded, and Charles offered little effective support. Not only was her father unforthcoming in providing military assistance to England in the years that followed, but the union did not result in children, although Richard and Anne were seemingly very committed to one another. Thus, as the years went by, the king's lack of a male heir would become a major political issue in England. The matter of the king's marriage and lack of children also fed into increasing discontent about the influence of a handful of close advisors of the young king, who were deemed to have too much influence over the governing of the realm. Chief amongst these was Michael de la Pole. De la Pole was a member of an English merchant family which had risen to power during the reign of Edward III by acting as the king's chief financier. Sir William de la Pole, Michael's father, had been made the chief baron of the English exchequer under Edward, and now Richard continued this preference for the family by appointing Michael as Lord Chancellor of England in 1383. 2 years later, he ennobled him as the first Earl of Suffolk, but de la Pole had been central to negotiating the marriage alliance with Charles IV. And as the alliance soured in the years ahead, de la Pole increasingly became a lightning rod for discontent within Richard's realms. Resentment at figures such as de la Pole and his influence increasingly coalesced in the mid-1380s around the issue of the war with France. On one side were Richard and his close advisors, such as de la Pole and the Earl of Oxford, Robert de Vere, who were aware of the need for financial stringency in order to avoid a repeat of the peasants' revolt, as well as the need for heavy taxes, as there could be no sustained large-scale campaign on the continent without them. On the opposite side was a court faction, increasingly led by the king's uncles, John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock. This loose coalition supported the resumption of large-scale campaigning in France to reinvigorate the war there, to how it had been during the glory days of Edward/III in the 1340s and 1350s. But they were to be disappointed. In 1385, when a French army landed in Allied Scotland and raids were carried out against northern England, Richard did lead an army into Scotland, accompanied by John of Gaunt. But having reached Edinburgh without engaging the Scots in any meaningful fashion, Richard elected to return home against John's pleas to continue the campaign further north to Fife. No sooner were they all back in England than joint Franco-Scottish raiding parties were attacking south as far as Durham and Carlisle. In northern England, these were inauspicious developments, where Edward III had once threatened Paris. The French were now operating on English soil. 1386 brought a fresh round of crisis for Richard and his government. A deep split had now opened between Richard's advisers and others, such as Gaunt and Buckingham. Rumors were even circulating that Gaunt would be murdered. This was partly responsible for John's decision shortly after the Scottish campaign to head for Spain to try to enforce his claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Castile there, which he had inherited through his marriage to Constance of Castile. He would not return to England for over 3 years. In the interim, his brother, Richard's other uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, became the leader of the discontented element in England. These were now increasingly opposed to de la Pole and his running of the government's finances and the handling of the war, most notably because it was widely believed that the only reason the French had not invaded southern England that year was owing to Charles VI being distracted by a revolt in the Low Countries, which drew his forces there instead. As a result, when the so-called Wonderful Parliament convened in the autumn of 1386, and de la Pole made requests for extensive new taxes, the Parliament responded by demanding reform of the government and greater oversight of the Crown's finances in return for agreeing to new taxes. The stage was set for a showdown. Richard's initial reaction to this call for additional parliamentary oversight of his administration and its finances, in particular, was reactionary. At first, he claimed that there was no possibility of him entertaining Parliament in this fashion, but when it became clear that the necessary taxes would not be granted to maintain the defense of the kingdom if he did not comply, he reluctantly agreed to allow the establishment of a limited parliamentary commission which could monitor royal expenses and spending for 1 year. Then he began planning his real response. In February 1387, he left London for a long countrywide tour designed to build support for a future confrontation with Parliament. For instance, he installed one of his closest advisers, the Earl of Oxford, Robert de Vere, as overseer of the powerful Palatine county of Chester, and he obtained a legal ruling from the Chief Justice of King's Bench, Sir Robert Tressilian, that the Wonderful Parliament's actions had been at least a breach of the law, and quite possibly treasonous. Others, such as the Mayor of London, Nicholas Brember, and ecclesiastical figures, such as the Archbishop of York, Alexander Neville, were also prepared for the coming confrontation. Richard finally returned to London in November 1387, after an 8-month absence. But his return did not go according to plan. No sooner had he reached the capital than the heads of the opposition within the government and Parliament confronted him. These were led by Thomas of Woodstock, who by this time had been elevated to the title of Duke of Gloucester. But the party went further than expected and presented claims of treason against a number of Richard's closest supporters, specifically de la Pole, de Vere, and Tressilian. Although Richard attempted to stall for time, his position was made impossible when Gloucester was joined by several other peers known to posterity as the Lords Appellant, chief amongst whom was the Earl of Derby. Henry Bolingbroke was John of Gaunt's eldest son and had stepped into the void created by his father's departure for Spain, when he combined with Gloucester, Richard's uncle. In late 1387, it presented to unified an opposition for the king to ignore them. In the weeks that followed, de Vere and de la Pole were forced to flee from England, and in the new merciless Parliament of 1388 they were sentenced to death in absentia, while Tressilian and several of Richard's other supporters were tried and executed in the months that followed. Thus, by 1388, the king had been severely humbled by a faction of his own family members and senior nobles who now exercised great control over the country. Eventually, the furor from the crisis of the wonderful Parliament and the Lords Appellant would abate, and Richard was able to re-establish his power as king as he entered his adult years. This quick about-face was in large part because the Lords Appellant were unable to follow through on the ambitious plans for the war which their party had been advocating for, in one shape or another, for much of the 1380s. Having removed de la Pole and others from the helm of state, Gloucester, Bolingbroke, and their allies found themselves confronted with exactly the same problem that the fallen Lord Chancellor had faced. There simply was not anywhere near enough money available to the English crown to conduct a large-scale military expedition into France. As a consequence, the government agreed in the autumn of 1388 to reopen peace talks with the French. For their part, the French were willing to countenance the same, as their own young king, Charles VI, was showing signs of a severe mental illness and psychotic episodes which would plague his long 42-year rule. Consequently, a truce, the Truce of Lullingham, was signed in July 1389, promising an end to hostilities for 3 years and concluding the hostilities which had been occurring on the Iberian Peninsula for decades as an extension of the war. With the temporary cessation of the 100 Years' War entered into, the cause of much of the tension between Richard and his nobles was removed for the time being. There were other developments at this time which allowed for the king and the Lords Appellant to make a clear break with the past. On the 3rd of May 1389, for instance, Richard, who was now 22 years of age, assumed full control of the government following his minority. He used the occasion to make it clear to the political nation that he considered that the conflicts of the past were due to his having been poorly advised by de la Pole, de Vere, and others. Richard almost certainly did not believe this, but the pretense that he did allowed for political reconciliation in England. At roughly the same time, John of Gaunt returned to England after his 3 years in exile in Spain and France. For all that he has been presented as an overmighty lord who wished to usurp Richard in the past, John would act as a stabilizing influence in England in the years that followed, bridging the gap between the more radical elements within the Lords Appellant and Richard himself. his return. Combined with these other changes, effectively ushered in a period of unprecedented stability during Richard's reign in the years that followed. The early and mid-1390s were the honeymoon period of Richard's reign, when some level of calm existed within England's own politics, and the country's foreign relations were also inherently stable. It consequently allowed for the flourishing of late medieval English culture. It was between the late 1380s and 1400 that Geoffrey Chaucer, an individual who had sat in the wonderful Parliament in 1386 and who was subsequently appointed as Clerk of the King's Work in 1389, composed the Canterbury Tales, widely regarded as a foundational text in the formation of modern English literature. Richard, as well as John of Gaunt, continued to patronize Chaucer throughout the 1390s. Elsewhere, Richard patronized numerous artists and writers. A notable example of this artistic work, which still survives today, is the Wilton diptych, religious panel painting which is housed today in the National Gallery in London. It depicts Richard kneeling before the Virgin and Child, while 3 English saints stand over him. The diptych is a striking example of late Gothic style on the cusp of the Renaissance. From an architectural perspective, Richard was also active in the 1390s, commissioning the master mason Walter Walton to add extensive and elaborate new royal apartments onto Portchester Castle in Hampshire in the latter years of his reign. As much as the 1390s ushered in a period of relative stability during Richard's reign, the lack of children and an heir remained a problem, and the prospect of children with his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, was ended in June 1394 when Anne died. Quite suddenly, the cause was most likely the same bubonic plague which had carried off Richard's older brother more than 20 years earlier. Although the most catastrophic outbreak of the disease in the 1340s and 1350s was not repeated in later years, periodic outbreaks of the plague continued across Europe for decades and even centuries to come. Anne now fell foul of one such incident in the summer of 1394, and Richard was devastated. Theirs had been a relationship of genuine affection. So grief-stricken was the king that he ordered the demolition of Sheen Manor in Surrey, the place where she had died. This possibly had graver consequences still for the reign and the realm. Historians have long speculated that Anne, as one of her husband's principal counselors, had a moderating impact on Richard, and that her death in the summer of 1394 ushered in a new period of reckless and autocratic behavior on the king's part. If this is so, her demise must be seen as a major factor in the deterioration of Richard's rule in the years that followed. For the time being, Richard simply sought to distract himself. Just weeks after his wife's death, he became the first English king in nearly 200 years to visit Ireland. Contingents of Cambran Ormond knights had first conquered much of Ireland for the English crown in the late 12th century, but the conquest had never been completed, with the Irish lords retaining control of large parts of West Ulster, Connaught, and parts of Munster and Leinster. No English king had visited the country since King John in 1210. And the advent of the 100 Years' War in France had seen the English lordship in Ireland starved of resources. As a result, during the 14th century, the Irish or Gaelic lords were resurgent, expanding westwards themselves to reconquer parts of the country which had been under English rule, notably East Ulster, where an earldom of Ulster had been created, but which was now restored to the rule of a branch of the O'Neills and other noble families there. all of the early indicators. Richard's reign had suggested that he had little interest in his Irish lordship, and in fact viewed the country solely as a political wilderness to which he could exile his enemies at home. But now, in 1394, he elected to undertake the first royal expedition to the country in over 170 years. This Irish sojourn would have interesting results. Richard landed near Waterford with an army of over 7,000 men in October 1394. He then campaigned primarily in Leinster and eastern Munster throughout the late autumn, winter, and spring of 1395, principally against Art MacMurrough of southern Leinster, who had recently tried to reinitiate a claim to the Irish high kingship, which had been dormant for several centuries. But this military activity was limited in range and effect. The real success of Richard's campaign lay in a series of treaties which he negotiated with some of the principal Irish lords, such as the great O'Neill of Tyrone in Ulster and the O'Briens of Thomond in the far west. These were effectively treaties whereby he attempted to recognize these Irish lords as English subjects if they promised to pay homage to him as Lord of Ireland. Political arrangements such as this would be tried decades later by the Tudors as part of their ultimately successful efforts to conquer Ireland. But it is noteworthy that Richard was employing this method much earlier in the late 14th century. This served to stabilize the political and military situation in Ireland somewhat in the mid-1390s. And with that done, Richard returned to England in May 1395. But it was not the last time he would set foot in Ireland, and the second visit would have greater political ramifications. Back at home, the major concern was with Richard's marital status, and of course, France. England needed time to restore its ability to pay for the wars on the continent, and France had to deal with a bitter civil war which was beginning over the issue of Charles VI's increasing bouts of mental illness. It seemed, in 1395, that the two issues could be confronted simultaneously. A proposal had been put forward in 1393 to bring a more lasting conclusion to the 100 Years' War if the French agreed to acknowledge Richard as the ruler of Aquitaine in western France, and also enlarge the size of that territory in return. For Richard, paying homage to Charles VI as his liege lord as King of France, but this latter stipulation, with its inference that the King of England was in some way a subject of the King of France, was politically unacceptable for the English government. Accordingly, new negotiations were entered into in the mid-1390s, whereby if the war could not be ended, it could at least be postponed for a very long time, and in such a way that both monarchs could save face. By late 1395, the basis of a 28 truce had been worked out, and the possibility of a sustained period of peace was on the horizon. As part of the proposed peace, it had been decided that Richard would also marry Isabella of Valois, the daughter of King Charles VI, and Isabeau of Bavaria. There was just one problem with this. Isabella was only 6 years of age, while Richard was nearing his 30th year. Even by the standards of the time, Isabella's age and the idea that she would be sent to live in a foreign land while still just a child was viewed as being problematic and was discussed during the negotiations. For their part, many on the English side were conscious that the marriage would not be consummated for many years, and Isabella would not produce any children, and consequently an heir for Richard for the better part of a decade at least. But in the end, the prospect of establishing a lasting peace between France and England after a half a century of near continuous warfare won out. Richard visited Paris in the autumn of 1396 to celebrate the union at the French court there, and days later, after returning to the English enclave at Calais, the wedding ceremony was performed on the 31st of October. The pair returned to England, where Isabella was crowned as queen the following year and was established with her own household and governess at Windsor Castle. Thus, the unusual marriage had resulted in a temporary cessation to hostilities in the 100 Years' War, but the issue of the succession to Richard was left precariously unsettled. The establishment of a more sustained peace with France in 1396 has often been viewed as having instilled a new determination in Richard to consolidate his power at home and seek revenge on many of those who had tried to overrule him a decade earlier. If this was the case, he had been harboring a grudge against figures such as his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, for 8 years, and he was now determined to act on it. Beginning in early 1397, Richard became a far more forceful and autocratic ruler than he had been during the early and mid-1390s. Accordingly, he developed a new faction of close followers, much like that which had centered on de la Pole and de Vere in the 1880s. This new coterie of adherents included individuals like John and Thomas Holland, whom he honored by promoting them to the titles of Duke of Exeter and Duke of Surrey, and Richard's first cousin, Edward of York, another grandson of Edward III. These and others were showered with new lands, titles, and political offices in 1397 and 1398. Additionally, he began building up a new power base in Western England and Wales to act as a counterbalance to the financial power of London and its hinterland. Simultaneous with this advancement of his own followers, Richard moved against his enemies. On the 11th of July, 1397, Thomas of Woodstock, 1st Duke of Gloucester, and several others who had acted with him in 1386 and 1387 were arrested. In the weeks that followed, their lands, offices, and titles were stripped from them, and it was these with which Richard rewarded his own followers in the months that followed. Trials followed from September 1397 onward, and eventually several of the lords were convicted and executed. Others were simply executed without judicial procedure, as seems to have been the case with Gloucester, who was killed while imprisoned late in 1397 to consolidate the situation. Richard had a new parliament convened at Shrewsbury. This was packed with his supporters, and during the course of 1398, it overturned much of the legislation and acts which had been passed through the Wonderful Parliament and the Merciless Parliament in 1386, 1387, and 1388. Moreover, the Parliament of Shrewsbury saw to it that power moving forward was far more consolidated in Richard and his faction's hand. Perhaps, given all this, there is little surprise that this period came to be known by near contemporaries as the tyranny. What all of this amounted to was an effort by Richard to establish a much more powerful and absolutist kingship. Signs of this were evident at court, where more deferential forms of address, such as High Majesty, were now adopted when speaking to the king. But Richard had badly miscalculated. Absolutist monarchs would later manage to emerge in the 16th and 17th centuries in England, France, and elsewhere, because these kings ran centralized states with a large taxation base that gave them the funding to be able to overawe their own nobles. This was most certainly not the case in 14th century England. The 100 Years' War had seen the crown desperately reliant on the nobility for funding and military contributions. As it did, the power of the nobility, relative to the king, had increased dramatically, such that historians have long spoken of the period as one of overmighty subjects, where the feudal order was compromised by certain lords becoming nearly as powerful as monarchs themselves. In this environment, Richard could not hope to impose the kind of absolutist kingship which he tried to without it garnering a major reaction from some of his nobles. Richard would learn that fact very quickly. There were many threats still present for Richard, even after the initial purges of 1397 and 1398. Principal amongst them was the Lancastrian royal line headed by John of Gaunt. John acted shrewdly and politically during the initial stages of the tyranny, not challenging the king and standing by while others, such as his brother Thomas, were effectively arrested and murdered by Richard. There was, after all, a possibility that he, or more likely, his eldest son, Henry Bolingbroke, would ascend to the throne in the near future if Richard were to die without an heir. But Richard was alive to this possibility too, and when Bolingbroke ended up in a quarrel at court with the Duke of Norfolk, Richard took the opportunity to banish Henry from England. Bolingbroke headed for France, where he learned shortly afterwards that his father had died of seemingly natural causes in England on the 3rd of February, 1399. Moreover, it was soon public knowledge that Richard had used John of Gaunt's death as an opportunity to fully disinherit Henry, stripping him of the vast Lancastrian estates in England. Henry was unwilling to accept this unchallenged, and by the spring of 1399, he was amassing a coalition of disaffected English nobles in exile in France with the intention of overthrowing Richard. Thus it was that Henry Bolingbroke, with a small group of followers, landed in Yorkshire in the summer of 1399. Bolingbroke's plans were aided by the fact that Richard had opportunely chosen this moment to depart once again for Ireland. Exactly why the king elected to undertake a second expedition to the country is a matter of debate. Conventionally, it has been assumed that he was unhappy with the Irish lords, whom he had made agreements with 4 years earlier, and the fact that these agreements had not been honored. However, a Welsh chronicler of the time called Adam of Usk suggests that Richard had intended to crown one of his rising court favorite, his nephew Thomas Holland, 1st Duke of Surrey, as King of Ireland, and that in this capacity Holland would be installed in Dublin with the goal of reinvigorating crown rule in Ireland. We may never know what the actual purpose of Richard's second expedition was, but we do know how it played out. He landed at Waterford on the 1st of June, 1399, with an army of approximately 3,000 men, but he would have quickly come to regret his decision as word reached Ireland of Bolingbroke's landing in England. As a result, Richard was no sooner arrived in Ireland than he was making plans for his departure. Consequently, he landed back in Wales on the 24th of July, just 7 weeks after reaching Ireland. It was a short but fateful trip which ensured that Bolingbroke's conspiracy was able to take effect in his absence. There was no real war to speak of between Richard and Henry in the end. After Henry had landed in Yorkshire, disaffected elements from all over northern England began rallying to his banner, while Richard had made the fatal error of bringing many of his key allies with him to Ireland, so that there was no concerted response to Bolingbroke's arrival within England. By the time Richard made landfall back in Wales, Henry had moved south towards London. His cause received a massive boost in late July when Edmund, Duke of York, the last living son of Edward III, and the man whom Richard had appointed as Lord Protector of England while he was in Ireland, gathered an army to confront Henry, and then changed his mind, and instead sided with Bolingbroke. Given all this, it was clear to Richard within days of his return that his cause was doomed. Consequently, on the 19th of August, Richard surrendered to Bolingbroke at Flint Castle in Wales. 2 weeks later, when the party had returned to London, he was imprisoned in the Tower. Within less than 3 months, Richard's absolutist reign had been overthrown. It was a stunning turn of events. The question now was, what would happen next? Henry had not launched his military campaign with a clear statement that he intended to usurp the throne from Richard and become king himself. Rather, he had presented himself as just a leading noble trying to bring an end to Richard's tyranny. But however he presented himself in public, there is no doubt that by the time he brought Richard back to London, he was determined to depose the king and have himself crowned as his successor. But this posed 2 problems. Firstly, a reasonable legal justification needed to be found for the removal of Richard from the throne. This would not go wanting, as the political community were willing to accept the idea that Richard's tyrannous behavior alone in recent years was a suitable basis on which to depose him. However, the second issue was thornier. Henry was not the next in line to the throne. This distinction fell to Edmund Mortimer, the 5th Earl of March, a great-grandson of Edward III, who was just 7 years old, but who had a better claim by right of his descent from Edmund Mortimer, Edward III's second oldest son, whereas Henry's right was as the son of the great king's third eldest son. However, this problem was rapidly overcome. Henry had been the one to overthrow Richard, and there was no appetite for another child king such as Richard had initially been in the late 1370s and 1380s. Accordingly, in haste, Richard was formally deposed on the 1st of October 1399, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned as King Henry IV of England. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 13th of October, Henry would rule for 14 years, generally fighting off rebellions in Wales and elsewhere, while his son, Henry V, would rule for a brief few years thereafter, during a period in which he recommenced the 100 Years' War in France in a strikingly successful manner at the famous Battle of Agincourt. But Richard, who, it should be remembered, was still only 32 years of age at the time of his deposition, would not live to see any of these latter victories in France. In January 1400, a number of the lords and courtiers whom Richard had promoted in the late 1390s, and who were now out of favor in England, attempted an insurrection known as the Epiphany Rising, with the goal of killing Henry and setting Richard free to become king once again. Henry received news of it before the rising could be successfully implemented, but in the aftermath of the failed coup, he was determined to ensure that no new rebellion could be launched on Richard's behalf. Accordingly, Richard was starved to death at Pontefract Castle in the first half of February 1400. He was buried shortly afterwards, without great fanfare, at King's Langley Priory, a Dominican priory in Hertfordshire. So died Richard II, but his usurpation by Bolingbroke and subsequent death had created a political uncertainty within England, which few can have imagined having the consequences which it would in years to come. The removal of Richard and the accession of Henry IV had opened the possibility that rival claimants to the throne, descended from the myriad family lines of Edward III's children, could press their own claims to the throne, and that possibility was not easily done away with once it had been employed once. Thus, when Henry IV's grandson, Henry VI, proved to be unfit to rule and often mentally incapacitated, then another great-grandson of Edward III's, through his fourth son, Edmund, began to press a claim to the throne in the 1450s. This was Richard, Duke of York, whose son Edward would eventually rule England as Edward IV. Thus, the autocracy of Richard II had created a situation whereby rival claims to the English throne could be pressed. Consequently, while the most intense period of the Wars of the Roses lies between the 1450s and the 1480s, many historians have suggested that its roots can actually be traced to the political crisis Richard created in the 1390s. In this way, Richard's actions in the last years of his rule might be viewed as the root of the Wars of the Roses. Richard, too, was one of England's most complex kings. In many ways, he was a victim of his circumstances. He somewhat unexpectedly ascended to the throne when he was just 10 years of age in 1377, owing to the premature deaths of both his father and older brother in the few years before the eventual death of Edward III. As a result, Richard's reign was substantially shaped by the individuals around him, while he himself was continuing to grow into an adult in the late 1370s and early 1380s. Already, before he could rule for himself, multiple crises had developed in his dominion, notably the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, owing to excessive levels of taxation to pay for the war with France, the spread of the Lollard heresy preached by John Wycliffe, and the drastic setbacks in the 100 Years' War. Consequently, there was little that he could do to remedy the situation when he began to take a more activist role in ruling England himself in the mid-1380s. This point was proved when the Lords Appellant managed to remove Richard's advisors and seize power. In England themselves, briefly in the late 1380s, they had called for a more aggressive approach to the war for years. But when they were provided with the opportunity to do so, they too could not figure out how to finance it, and eventually a temporary cessation of hostilities with France was agreed in 1389. These qualifications aside, there is no doubting that Richard was responsible for the deterioration in his kingdom in the late 1390s. After several years of stability in the early and mid-1390s, he elected from 1397 onwards to begin moving against several of those lords who had challenged his authority. Years earlier, at this point, Richard attempted to effectively introduce a species of absolute monarchy, one in which the power of the king would be unchallenged by his nobility. In doing so, he set off a new political crisis in England, one which eventually saw opposition coalesce around his first cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. In the course of just a few short months, in 1399, Henry seized power, deposed his cousin, and proclaimed himself as King Henry IV. In these events lay some of the origins of the Wars of the Roses, which would destabilize England for much of the 15th century. Richard was responsible for this insofar as he misjudged the extent of his power. Had he lived in the 17th century and been the ruler of a centralized, early modern bureaucratic state, he might well have been able to exercise the brand of absolutism which he attempted to impose from 1397 onward. But this was the late Middle Ages, and any king still had to appease his feudal lord. Richard failed to recognize that, and it was ultimately his downfall and the beginning of much strife in England. What do you think of King Richard II? Was he a very poor monarch who was responsible for igniting the Wars of the Roses? Or was he a victim of circumstance, one whose reign largely played out while he was still a child and a teenager? Let these thoughts drift through your mind as you settle into peaceful sleep, dear listener. Sweet dreams until we meet again for part 2 of our gentle journey through England's most troubled kings. Henry, later known as King Henry VI of England and France, came into this world on the 6th of December, 1421, during the height of the 100 Years' War. His mother, Catherine of Valois, was born in Paris on the 27th of October, 1401, to King Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria. She was their youngest daughter and sister of Charles VII. She would wed Henry VI's father, King Henry V, at 18 years old on the 2nd of June, 1420. But little of her early years are documented as a younger princess. Henry V was crowned king on the 9th of April, 1413, but at the time of his birth, on the 16th of September, 1386, he was not in the direct line of succession. In 1399, his father, Henry Bolingbroke, cousin of King Richard II, seized the throne, becoming Henry IV, the first Lancastrian monarch. As a result, Henry V came to be in the line of succession and was given the title Prince of Wales. His military career began at an early age and would continue throughout his life, culminating in the invasion of France in 1415 and the Battle of Agincourt, which broke the truce negotiated by Richard II to press his claim to the French throne through his descent from Edward III, and reignited the 100 Years' War. This French campaign would conclude in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes, in which King Charles VI acknowledged Henry as heir to the French throne. Henry's war in France would continue, now allied with the Burgundians, against the Armagnac. He returned to England early in 1421, where he progressed around the country and would be joined in March by Catherine following her coronation. After receiving news of his brother Thomas' death in March at Baugé, Henry returned to France in June 1421. Several battles followed, including that which was to be his last at the Siege of Meaux. He would die from dysentery 3 months following the conclusion of the siege at the castle of Vincennes on the 31st of August 1422, having never met his son. As the only son of Henry V, the 9-month-old Henry became King Henry VI upon his father's death. However, as an infant, clearly there was no way that Henry could rule. Close to death, Henry V had made provisions in his will for the protection and upbringing of his son, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Henry's youngest brother, who had earlier in 1422 been designated as keeper of the realm, was accorded with the protection and defense of the young prince. But governorship of the boy was to go to the Duke of Exeter, Thomas Beaufort, while the regency of France would pass to John, Duke of Bedford, Henry's eldest younger brother, until such time as the young Henry was old enough to rule. However, there would be bad feeling over some of the provisions in the will, namely that Humphrey was not seen as a good choice for regent of England. Instead, despite his arguments for himself, which continued throughout his life, he was appointed by Parliament to defend the realm and hold the position of chief counselor to the king, but without the powers of a regent. As the youngest of the 2 surviving brothers, these powers would be given up to John whenever he was present in England. A council would be formed until such time as the king came into his majority. Among those who would sit on this council was Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester. Shortly after the death of his father, Charles VI of France died, and by virtue of the Treaty of Troyes, Henry now succeeded to the throne of France at still less than a year old. However, this was not accepted throughout the whole of France, as Dauphin Charles' claim to the throne was acknowledged by the Armagnacs, who still held sway in central and southern France. The Dauphin, although disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes, was proclaimed Charles VII on the 30th of October, 1422, as was usual. Catherine, although involved in her son's upbringing and choice of servants, was not his principal carer. He was placed under the control of Elizabeth Ryman and cared for by a small team of nurses before being given over to the care of a new governess, Lady Alice Butler. She was to begin his teaching in courtesy, discipline, and other appropriate matters, and was given provision to provide reasonable chastisement without reprisals to the young king when necessary. Henry would make his first appearance in public life shortly before his second birthday at the opening of Parliament. This long-held tradition of the monarch being present for the opening of Parliament is still upheld today, although in a somewhat modernized form. In June 1428, Richard Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, was appointed as Henry's guardian to continue his education in matters of kingship, piety, and martial arts. Records remain of 2 little coat armors made for him at 7 years old, and that he was given a long-bladed sword for to learn the king to play in his tender age. But such was the efficacy of his education by Lady Alice already at this time, that in March 1428, his ruling council estimated that he would be able to take a more active hand in governance in just a few years. However, this statement also alludes to the friction within the council caused by Gloucester's continual seeking of power, and offered a form of resistance to him. During this first decade of Henry's life, the war in France against the Armagnacs continued under his uncle John, Duke of Bedford. In August 1424, Bedford and his English and Norman forces assembled on the Verneuil plain in Normandy, heavily outnumbered by the combined force of the French and Scots, who were allied to the Armagnacs at this time. The initial assault by the Lombard cavalry broke through the English lines, but after a hard-fought battle, Bedford's forces prevailed, marking the high point of the English campaign. It is estimated that almost half of the assembled French force died on the field that day. The battles continued to push back the Armagnacs, and in late 1428, the siege of Orleans began. However, their earlier success would not be repeated. Thomas Montacute, Earl of Salisbury, who'd been present by Bedford's side in France for many years, was killed early on during the siege, and despite being replaced by a competent commander, the English couldn't storm the heavily fortified city. The appearance of Joan of Arc, first in the court of Charles VII in February 1429, and then at Orleans in April, would signal their upcoming defeat. Joan and her retinue entered the town easily despite the English blockade, and after only 4 days of fighting, the English lifted the siege and retreated on the 8th of May. Further battles would follow, where Joan was present, with many English supporting towns capitulating in the face of her advancing force, including Reims in July. Reims had long been considered a holy site, as it was in the cathedral of this city, where the kings were consecrated with the holy oil. And so, with its capitulation, Charles entered Reims on the 16th of July, his coronation. An anointing took place the next day. On the 17th of July, 1429, Henry's counselors realized that a strong response was necessary following the coronation of Charles and the defeats at the hands of Joan of Arc. It was decided that Henry, despite his age, should be crowned, and so preparations began. His coronation would take place on the 6th of November, 1429, at Westminster. But this on its own would not be enough, and so on the 23rd of April, 1430, Henry set out for France alongside the Earl of Warwick, accompanied by a retinue of over 300 and an army at his back. Henry stayed first in Calais until the route to Rouen had been secured before setting out, and arrived in the city at the end of July. It is noted that upon his arrival in Rouen, he was greeted by a cheering crowd, and the noise was such that Henry asked that it be stopped, perhaps giving an indication of a sensitive nature. He was to remain there until such time as it was safe to make the journey to Paris, and to this end would be in Rouen for over a year. Early into his stay in France, Joan of Arc was captured in May 1430 by the Burgundians at the siege of Compiègne. She would later be sold to the English, tried for heresy, and burnt at the stake in Rouen in May 1431. Although Henry was in Rouen at the same time as the trial took place, it is unclear whether he was present for any of the proceedings. It was at some point around this time that Catherine married her second husband, the Welsh Owen Tudor, in secret. Their first child, Edmund, would be born shortly after they were married. They would have 2 more sons, Jasper and Owen, and a daughter, of whom little is known. Owen, as a Welshman, was granted letters of denizenship by Parliament in 1432. But the marriage was kept out of the public sphere. Henry finally arrived in Paris in December of 1431. His coronation took place on the 16th of December, but by all accounts, it was a hurried affair. The ceremony was performed by the now Cardinal Beaufort rather than a French bishop, and the feast that followed the ceremony was said to be disappointing. However, it is likely that the coronation was somewhat overshadowed, as just 3 days before, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, had concluded a truce with Charles VII that would last for the next 6 years. Henry left France on the 29th of January, 1432, and would never return. During the years 1432 to 1436, the king was still in his minority. However, Henry was clearly starting to realize his position, and in 1432, Warwick requested more power within his guardianship of the boy to protect himself from defiance on the part of Henry, and any possible punishment amounting from his chastise, ments. At the same time, he also requested that those men of questionable virtues be kept apart from Henry to keep from influencing the impressionable young king. There was still friction among the council at this time, much of it involving Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort, which was moderated in some part by Bedford. Their differences had been clear throughout their time serving together, but now it was their views on the continuing war in France that would come to the fore. Gloucester's views differed greatly from Beaufort's. There had been talk of making peace with the Armagnacs off and on for some years, but it wasn't until late 1435 that serious efforts to this end were made with the Congress of Arras in August and September 1435. The Congress led by Beaufort would not bring about peace, and just a week after it ended, Bedford died on the 14th of September. Another week after that, on the 21st of September, a treaty between the Burgundians and French was sealed, declaring the Burgundians' defection from the side of the English. The capture of Paris followed in April 1436. Henry attended his first council meeting in October 1435 in response to the failure of Arras, and began taking an active role in government, although still guided by his councillors. But the roles played by Beaufort and Gloucester in trying to secure their influence over Henry, more so since Bedford's death, would serve to mold the king into someone who depended on others to tell him what to do rather than allowing him to become a man confident in his own decisions. Another prominent influence in his life, Warwick, his guardian of almost 8 years, resigned the position in May 1436 with no replacement. By the end of July 1436, Henry signed his first warrant, a grant to Beaufort, just days after Gloucester left for Calais. Henry continued through 1436 and 1437 to issue warrants, still alongside his council, rewarding and patronizing many of those that had been among his household through the years, with new roles within government and prominent positions in the kingdom. This included William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, who had been steward of the household since 1433. Suffolk was appointed as chief steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, and like Beaufort and Gloucester, would become a major influence in Henry's reign. In 1437, the council tentatively began to consult the king on matters of appointment where it was said he deferred to their advice. In mid-1437, Henry asserted his piety in siding with Pope Eugenius IV against the Council of Bâle. He also shared Beaufort's views that making peace in France would be preferable to continuing the conflict, giving Beaufort the opportunity to further exert his influence over the king. On the 12th of November 1437, a great council was convened, and Henry announced his intention to step fully into his role as king whilst keeping his counsel. But 1437 not only marked Henry's step into ruling. His mother, Catherine, had fallen ill in 1436 and moved to Bermondsey Abbey later that year, where she was tended to, but she would die on the 3rd of January. Her 2 eldest sons and half-brothers, Henry, would be placed in the care of Suffolk's sister, Catherine de la Pole, abbess of Barking Abbey, possibly at the suggestion of Suffolk to the king, whilst Owen Tudor would be imprisoned for 2 years. During Henry's minority, the kingdom's finances were already under strain from the continuing war in France, and frequently expenditure outstripped the income. On top of this, the crown inherited debt not only from Henry V, but also from Henry IV, which the council were slow to rectify. On many occasions, the crown found itself in need of aid, and so they borrowed extensively. Cardinal Beaufort was one of their principal lenders. A vastly wealthy man, he had already been lending to the crown under Henry V. Now, stepping into his reign, Henry's generosity to his expanding household in granting many patronages would further undermine attempts to balance the books early. Signs of the poor attention he gave to matters of rule, and perhaps something of a lack of understanding of resources, can be seen when he willingly signed a number of petitions which directly impoverished the crown and weakened the local governing of parts of the realm. These grants continued throughout his reign, and coupled with military expenditure and a worsening economy, would continue to adversely affect the finances of the realm. Despite attempts by the council to curb Henry's generosity, the worsening financial situation would contribute, in time, to rebellion. Although very willing to hand out grants of office, Henry lacked knowledge on the finer diplomatic points of his actions and realm. In 1441, Among the many grants he handed out was the stewardship of the Duchy of Cornwall to the Earl of Devon, who'd made a petition to the King. Lord Bonville had been appointed royal steward in Cornwall for life in 1437, of which the Duchy of Cornwall fell within the bound. The two men were already feuding at the time. Shortly after this appointment, Henry was forced to write to Devon and ask that he not take up the office until further discussions had taken place in the council, a request which Devon refused. Following violence between the parties, later in the year both men would give up the stewardships, and although the exact outcome of an arbitration in the following year is unknown, Devon still regarded himself as the rightful steward. This situation was not uncommon, and it has been suggested that in some cases Henry was uncertain whether the grants he made could be implemented, as many of them carried a caveat that they should only take effect if an identical patent had not already been issued. In a number of cases, duplicated grants that were contested by the newer party, or those that were overgenerous, would have to be formally cancelled by members of the government. Throughout the 1440s, Henry also frequently interfered with justice. The court process during this period was complicated, and it was a difficult and long process for many to attain justice. Many cases would be referred to the King's Council, where the lower courts could not or would not make a judgment. Throughout this period, Henry issued many pardons for wide-ranging crimes, including attempted rape and murder, further undermining the struggling justice system. The immediate years following his minority were spent in the pursuit of peace with France, despite ongoing military campaigns, of which Henry showed little in the way of decisive leadership. Indeed, it was noted that his interference in matters concerning France often proved a hindrance. Abortive attempts were made in 1438, before the Congress of Oy began in the summer of 1439, but would conclude only with a truce with the Burgundians. However, there was still the possibility of further discussions, as the talks had not been formally terminated. And so, in 1440, Henry revisited the option of releasing the Duke of Orleans, who had been a prisoner in England since the Battle of Agincourt. Gloucester was staunchly against this idea, but with his militaristic attitude, his influence was waning, and it was the arguments of Beaufort and Archbishop Kemp, alongside advice from Suffolk, that swayed the king. It has been said that ultimately Henry's decision to free Orleans lacked substance and was driven by his deep convictions for want of peace, given his lack of interest in military matters. Nevertheless, the first part of Orleans' ransom was raised by the French, and he was released later that year at the beginning of November, but would quickly fail in his mission to broker a peace. It appears that Henry's mind was in part elsewhere during the negotiations when in September of 1440 and February of 1441 he founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, and involved himself in the supervision of their building. Eton was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and these acts of founding acted as much in the king's interest of education as it did his piety. Such was his interest in education, more than that of any other king, that there are records of Henry donating many of his own books to All Souls College in Oxford and King's Hall, Cambridge, in this promotion of education. He felt akin to Alfred the Great, and such was his admiration for Alfred that he dedicated much time and effort in 1442 to having him canonized. Although his efforts would ultimately fail, it was in 1441 that Gloucester's influence over the king would finally come to an end when his second wife, Eleanor Cobham, with ambitions to be queen, sought the advice of astrologers and necromancers, who predicted that Henry would succumb to sickness in the summer of 1441. Rumors of this soon circulated, and in July she was arrested. She was forcibly divorced from Gloucester and imprisoned for the rest of her life. Gloucester's reputation would never recover. In 1443, after the failure of peace talks and further French victories, the decision was made to send another expedition to France. Both Normandy and the long-held Duchy of Gascony needed relief, but the treasury could not support two expeditions, and so eventually Gascony was selected. The force to be led by the first Duke of Somerset, John Beaufort. It has been suggested that the decision to undertake the campaign was down to Cardinal Beaufort. Indeed, Somerset was his nephew, but the campaign would end in failure. Somerset would die soon after his return to England, and Beaufort would retire from active duties as counsellor, although he would still continue to exert some influence and offer informal counsel. Without the influences of Gloucester and Beaufort, Suffolk now moved to the fore. Given the perilous financial situation within England, drained further by the ongoing war, a peace was needed, and so, at the insistence of Henry, but not without some reluctance, Suffolk traveled to France in early 1444 to negotiate a marriage with Margaret of Anjou, the niece of Charles VII. Before departing, however, Suffolk made sure to protect himself and asked for a public declaration that neither he nor his colleagues would be held responsible should they fail, which Henry duly granted. The negotiations concluded on the 22nd of May, resulting in the betrothal of Margaret to Henry on the 24th, and the sealing of a 2-year truce on the 28th. Suffolk acted as proxy during the betrothal ceremony, and on his return to England was richly rewarded, first with the wardship of Margaret Beaufort, the deceased Somerset's daughter, and later in the year was raised to the rank of Marquis. Suffolk would return to France at the end of 1444 to continue the negotiations, and early in 1445 once again acted as proxy for Henry in his wedding to Margaret, where, after recovering from a period of illness that had begun in France, made worse by the sea crossing, she journeyed to Titchfield Abbey and was married to Henry on the 22nd of April, 1445. Margaret would stay at one of Cardinal Beaufort's manors for a short time before making her way to London, where she arrived on the 28th of May and was crowned 2 days later. Rumors abounded, however, that during the negotiations Suffolk had been instructed by the king to cede land to the French, and although he would report to Parliament that this was not the case, his reputation suffered. Suffolk kept his position, and over the ensuing years would increase his influence at court. When many of his own men were appointed to prominent positions within the council, the marriage seems to have been a happy one, and the king was generous with his wife, buying her jewels and horses, and in 1448 he allowed her to found Queen's College, Cambridge. They spent much time together in the royal palaces, but despite this, it would be 8 years before a child was born of their union. Why it took the couple so long to produce an heir is unknown, but Henry was said to be of a prudish nature. Accounts survive of a visit to Bath in 1449, where he was said to be shocked and embarrassed to see men and women bathing naked together. Another similar event occurred at a Christmas pageant, which featured women with bared breasts, to which the king is said to have stormed out at the sight. Following his wedding, Henry actively sought peace with Charles VII. Both rulers were said to be enthusiastic about making an agreement, but only extensions to the truce were concluded. When the first of the French envoys arrived in London in 1445, Henry is noted to have greeted them personally, showing almost excessive friendliness towards them. Although much of the negotiations took place between envoys, Henry did assert that he was happy to travel to France to speak in person to Charles. However, this meeting would never come to pass. Throughout the war, whenever peace was on the table, the English had been unwilling to cede land, but this was about to change. In December 1445, Henry wrote to Charles that he was willing to cede Maine to the French in the pursuit of peace between them. This act by Henry was in response to envoys from Charles and Duke René, Margaret's father, and in return would enact a 20-year truce. Henry, acting on his own initiative, personally authorized the document, although in some part he was said to have been influenced by his wife in coming to this decision. The move by Henry was deeply unpopular and resisted by the English commanders in France. The original date for the cession was to be the 30th of April, 1446. But this day came and went without the land being handed over. Opposition to the current French policy in England was led, predictably, by Gloucester, who had always maintained a stance of not ceding any territory. A parliament, originally scheduled to take place in Cambridge, was rearranged to meet in Bury St. Edmunds, a stronghold of Suffolk's influence, and Gloucester was summoned to attend. Rumors that Gloucester was plotting against Henry had seemingly been spread, and the king apparently believed them, for on Gloucester's arrival on the 18th of February, 1447, he was denied access to the king and told to go instead to his lodging. Gloucester was arrested later that day on a dubious charge of treason, but would not face trial until 5 days later, and on the 23rd of February he was found dead. There has been some suggestion that Suffolk, along with others, persuaded the king of his uncle's intentions to raise the Welsh against him, as Gloucester had holdings there. But it is likely that Suffolk's true intent was to silence opposition to the French policy that he was now pursuing, albeit without the intention of the Duke's death. In order to prevent rumors of foul play, his body was displayed in church. In the following months, a number of those arrested alongside him were tried and sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. But in a show of mercy and compassion, Henry pardoned them as the executions were taking place, and even allowed the return of their confiscated possessions and estates. But in years to come, the myth of the good Duke Humphrey would cause many to believe that those in the king's service had conspired to bring about his death, damaging the standing of the king. There would be another prominent death for Henry in the same year, when the 72-year-old Cardinal Beaufort died on the 11th of April, 1447. Both Henry and his queen were remembered in Beaufort's will and were bequeathed a number of items, as well as provision for substantial donations to Eton and King's College. But there was still opposition from his commanders in France. Henry authorized his new king's commissioners to use force if necessary, to take custody of the holdings in Maine in preparation for the cession in his fervent pursuit of peace. Finally, after much back and forth and dragging of heels by those appointed by Henry to facilitate the cession, Maine was given over in March 1448, but not without a show of force by Charles, who briefly laid siege to Le Mans. Ultimately, the extended truce granted by the cession would be short-lived, and in the ensuing years, Henry would lose control of both Normandy and Gascony, following an attack on the Breton town of Foughers by the English in March 1449. This attack was launched on the pretext of freeing the pro-English Guile, brother to the Duke of Brittany, and a great childhood friend of Henry, and was orchestrated by Suffolk and the second Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort. The attack led to a French declaration of war in July. Other monarchs, such as Henry's own father, would have seized on the opportunity to lead a force to recapture the territory lost to the French. But this was not the case for Henry, and there is no suggestion of such an idea ever having been raised at the time. The 100 Years' War would come to an end with a French victory in 1453. Henry's mismanagement of funds over the years and his fiscal prioritization of domestic projects and patronages rather than the war effort and lack of military leadership can in part be blamed for the English defeat. It was during this tumultuous time that the downfall of Suffolk and other prominent members of the council came about in the years leading up to 1450. Suffolk's influence in court was prominent as fewer councillors attended meetings, and it has been suggested that he was attempting to strengthen his line by betrothing his eldest son to Margaret Beaufort. Owing to the situation in France and the loss of Rouen in October, Parliament was called late in 1449, and soon they were seeking a scapegoat for this disastrous turn of events. Dissatisfaction with the handling of France and anger over the loss of long-held territories was rife throughout the country. The first victim of the dissatisfaction was the keeper of the Privy Seal, Bishop Adam Molins, one of Suffolk's most fervent supporters, who was murdered in Portsmouth on the 9th of January 1450 by a soldier set to embark for France to go to the aid of Normandy. When Parliament reconvened after Christmas, late in January of 1450, Suffolk declared his loyalty to the crown, but 4 days later, the House of Commons petitioned for his arrest. He was impeached on the 7th of February with many spurious charges, including treason, laid against him. On the 9th of March, Suffolk denied all charges before the King and Parliament. Finding himself to be in a difficult position, Henry would deal with the matter himself, and on the 17th of March, the Lords of Parliament and Suffolk gathered in his personal chamber. Suffolk once again protested his innocence, and Henry dismissed the charge of treason, but found him guilty of lesser charges and sentenced him to banishment for 5 years in an effort to protect him. Suffolk was removed from London during the night of the 19th of March, but despite the secrecy was hounded part of the way to his estate in Suffolk by a group of Londoners. 2 days later, there was rioting in London, due to start his banishment. On the 1st of May, he took ship from Ipswich, heading for Calais, where he would continue his journey to the Duke of Burgundy's lands in the Low Countries. But his ships were intercepted in the Straits of Dover. He was taken aboard a ship called the Nicholas of the Tower, where he was held for a short while before being beheaded on the 2nd of May, 1450. His body lay on a Dover beach, and it was said that his head was placed on a pole next to it. Given the unrest, when Parliament resumed on the 29th of April after the Easter break, it was held in Leicester, and the King would be in attendance. The issue of resumption had been put forward in previous sessions of Parliament, but initially Henry resisted any major implementation and insisted that his previous grants should stand so that his credibility would not suffer further. Now, in this latest session, the issue was raised again by the Commons. In an effort to take back a portion of lost revenue, a bill was put forward that would revert hereditary grants to life grants, thus returning land to the crown upon death. This bill pertained to all grants made by Henry since the start of his reign, but with some exemptions. As patronage had always been a part of a king's rule, it wasn't until the 6th of May, when news of Suffolk's death reached them, that the king accepted the bill. But in the coming month, nearly 200 exemptions would be attached to it, thus defeating its purpose. The issue of resumption would be raised again in the next year's session of Parliament 1452-51. Given the failings of the first, fewer exemptions would be made. But this time Eton and King's College were not entirely exempt, as their grants were heavily burdening the crown. Also, within this bill, Parliament tried to curtail the king in his future patronages by proposing that all future grants were to be examined by the 3 principal officers of state and a minimum of 6 councillors who would have the power to authorize them. However, Henry refused to give his consent to this part of the act, as he did not want his own initiatives restricted. Further exemptions were added to the bill before it was eventually passed by the king, and proved to be somewhat more effective than the first bill in the return of revenue to the crown. It was the very issue that resumption was trying to solve that led, in part, to the disaffection within the realm. Losses in France, the financial situation, and ill feeling towards those among Henry's councillors whom it was thought used their positions to benefit themselves all added to growing tension. Criticism had not been leveled at Henry, but the deaths of 2 of his closest advisers and feelings towards others highlighted just how little control he had. This disaffection was felt heavily in Kent, where a combination of French raids on the coast, slow recompense for the soldiers passing through the county to and from France, and the rumor that Kent was to be punished for Suffolk's death, all added up to the beginning of a rebellion in late May of 1450, led by Jack Cade, also known as John Cade. Cade would also go under the alias John Mortimer, perhaps in an attempt to link himself to the Duke of York. News of the rebellion reached Parliament in Leicester on the 6th of June, and shortly after, Henry returned to London, but not before arrangements were made for 2 separate commissions of lords to quash the uprising before the forces could be raised. However, the rebels journeyed to Blackheath, arriving on the 11th of June, where they made camp. Initially, the plan was to suppress them, and Henry announced that he would accompany those charged with this duty to confront the rebels, but was soon persuaded by his councillors to change his mind after an assessment of their strength was made. Despite swearing loyalty, part of their demands was to see the removal of certain powerful men that surrounded the king. They were instead offered a pardon to return to their lands, and so dismissed negotiations. When Henry changed his mind again and decided to go heavily armed to Blackheath, they found on their arrival on the 18th of June that the rebels had withdrawn back to Kent. A small force of around 400 was sent in pursuit, but were ambushed, and many were killed near Tunbridge. Those who survived fled. They were in turn pursued by a larger force who pushed through Kent indiscriminately, which only served to bolster the resolve of the rebels. Meanwhile, a growing number of those loyal to the crown threatened to defect unless certain high-ranking members within the king's circle, who they considered traitors, were arrested. Henry capitulated to their demands and ordered the arrest of Lord Say on the 19th of June. Say was a long-serving member of the council and had been one of Suffolk's supporters. The next day, Henry would publicly encourage the arrest of others who were considered traitors. Henry returned to Westminster and secretly summoned Lord Say from the Tower, likely an effort to offer his protection as he had done with Suffolk. But this order was refused by the constable, as the situation deteriorated and men defected to Cade. Discussions were held in which Henry was persuaded to withdraw from London, and so on the 25th of June he left and made his way to Kenilworth Castle. Henry called for forces to be bolstered at Kenilworth for his protection, but made no effort to send troops to London 69 years earlier. In 1381, Richard II had confronted the leaders of the peasants' revolt. Now it seemed that Henry's mind had changed again, and had no further intention to do so, choosing to flee instead. The defense of London was now in the hands of the mayor and common council. With news of the king's departure, the rebels turned back to London and encamped in Southwark, just to the south of London Bridge, but initially were unable to enter London itself. The king's abandonment of the city had a demoralizing effect on those left to defend it, and when another rising occurred in Essex, rebel numbers were soon bolstered. Cade would cross the bridge on the 3rd of July, and despite previous pronouncements of keeping the king's peace, demonstrated by the beheading of one of his offending officers, he would involve himself in acts of criminality. As a conciliatory act to quell the disaffection, Henry, on the 1st of July, nominated a commission of Oyer and Terminer to deal with those named as traitors. Cade was present for these sessions at the Guildhall. Many of those brought into the sessions were condemned, including Lord Say, who was brought from the Tower and denied the right to be tried by his peers, and William Cromer, Sheriff of Kent, and Say's son-in-law. Say and Cromer were condemned and executed, and alongside many others, their heads were placed on spikes and paraded through the city. Say's lifeless body was dragged through the streets as they made their way to Southwark, attached to Cade's saddle. But it seems the Londoners had had enough, and on the night of the 5th of July, they fought the rebels and prevented them from crossing the bridge back into the city, eventually being able to close the gate, barring them from entering. The victory had been costly, and many citizens lay dead after the fight. Negotiations quickly followed, with the Queen offering a pardon to Cade. Following further negotiations and the receiving of petitions from the rebels, they were given charters of pardon. Many within the rebel force took up the offer of the pardon, but Cade shunned it and crossed back into Kent. He was proclaimed a traitor on the 10th of July, with a bounty of 1,000 marks placed on him, and the spoils he had taken were seized and sold off to raise funds. He was captured in Heath, Sussex, on the 12th of July, and died of wounds sustained in his apprehension. His naked body was brought back to Southwark and beheaded, and his head displayed on London Bridge. His body was drawn through the city before being quartered. Henry returned to London. Towards the end of July, unrest continued in the southeast, and so another commission of Oyer and Terminer was appointed to investigate those in connection with the complainants from Kent. Many royal officials and Kent landowners were brought before the justices, but their punishments for those who were found guilty were light. Similarly, those who continued with the rebellion, having shunned the pardon, were sought to make a show that treason would not be tolerated. But, despite this, the trouble and dissension with royal officials continued well into 1451, spilling over into other areas across the country. Amidst the turmoil in 1450, Richard, Duke of York, the king's cousin, returned from Ireland, where he'd been lieutenant since December 1447, a post he'd previously held in France after Bedford's death. unduly disturbed by the references to York throughout the rebellion. Orders were issued by Henry's usher of the chambers to delay York's landing, and so when he attempted to land at Beaumaris in Anglesey was denied and would instead land further down the Welsh coast. When he eventually reached London on the 27th of September, he met with Henry briefly and would stay in the city for 2 weeks. During this time, they communicated through a series of bills in which York rebuffed those he had been associated with during the rebellion and offered to take a leading hand in government to quell the disquiet. Henry acknowledged York as his loyal subject and beloved cousin, but instead of accepting his proposal, instead stated that a new council was to be established, which York was to be a part of. After only 2 weeks, York left London to tour his estates in the Midlands before Parliament opened in November, on the 3rd of December of 1450. In order to quell the unrest that was rife in London, Henry and a great number of the lords rode out through the city. It seemed that this parade had the desired effect and tempers cooled. York was dispatched to punish the rebels still in Kent and Sussex later that month. Later in 1451, during the same session of Parliament, Henry refused the attainder against the deceased Suffolk proposed by the Commons, and would appoint York's rival, Somerset, as captain of Calais. In what was to be the final session of Parliament, the issue of succession was raised by Thomas Young, an ally of York, as the king had so far failed to produce an heir, and with Bedford and Gloucester dead, there was no clear successor to Henry. Both Somerset and York had claims, but Thomas put it to Parliament that York should be acknowledged as heir presumptive, and the Commons refused to continue with any other business until York had been named. Henry was stirred to action, and had Thomas arrested and sent to the Tower, and immediately dissolved Parliament. York was dealt a further blow in 1452, when the Speaker of the previous Parliament session, and one of York's allies, William Oldhall, was forcibly removed by order of Somerset from sanctuary at St. Martin-le-Grand Church. He was charged with looting possessions from Somerset's property during the Trouble in 1450, but also with the spurious charge of plotting against the king on York's behalf. This only served to inflame the feud that already existed between York and Somerset, who was by now a leading member of the government and firmly in Henry's favor. York gathered a host and marched to Dartford, intent on removing Somerset, who, for his part, gathered a great number of the lords and the king himself, and went out to meet York, making camp at Blackheath. Negotiations were held at the beginning of March, and York laid out his grievances, most of which were against Somerset, but failed to gain the support of the king and lordly retinue. York was returned to London, and 2 weeks later made to swear a humiliating oath of allegiance to the crown in St. Paul's Cathedral. Following this, Somerset's influence grew in Parliament, whereas York would lose the lieutenancy of Ireland to a man who he had once considered an ally, but who now moved towards Somerset's sphere of influence. The remainder of 1452 was spent in the continued effort of putting an end to those rebels still at large in Kent, to which end many were executed and their heads displayed on London Bridge. Although Henry would issue another general pardon to all those but the murderers of the bishops, Malines and Isco, he would also embark on a judicial tour of lands held by York, making himself visible to the populace, and took a hand in dispensing justice to those involved in the attempted uprising as one of the commissioners of Oyer and Terminer. Henry accepted many petitions during this time, but some, at the direction of Somerset, were forced to submit to the king, while others were hanged in October. They would see some success in France when Bordeaux was retaken, having been captured by the French the year before. But although there had been some discussion of Henry joining the campaign earlier in the year, this once again didn't happen. In November, Henry raised Edmund and Jasper Tudor to the earldoms of Richmond and Pembroke, positions that had once been held by his uncles Bedford and Gloucester, and in early 1453, Parliament accepted a petition to formally acknowledge the boys as the king's half-brothers. The wardship of Margaret Beaufort was given to the brothers, and Edmund would marry her. In November 1455, at 13 years old, she would give birth to her only son, Henry Tudor, on the 28th of January, 1457. More good news graced the court in 1453, when it was announced that Queen Margaret was pregnant with a long-awaited heir. Henry was generous in granting a reward to the messenger that brought him the news. But the modest recovery of Henry's rule was short-lived when news came of a terrible defeat in France in July. Just a short while later, in early August 1453, Henry collapsed into a catatonic state while at the Royal Hunting Lodge in Clarendon. Henry's precise illness has not been identified, but it has been termed as a severe mental collapse, which left him completely incapacitated and in no way able to rule, even in appearance. It was said that he recognized no one, could not speak, nor clean or feed himself. His grandfather, Charles VI of France, had suffered bouts of madness during his life where he would become violent, among other symptoms, but there is no suggestion that Henry suffered in this way. Initially, Henry's sickness was kept secret, but this state could not continue when he failed to recover after some weeks. Finally, after the birth of Henry's only child, Edward, on the 13th of October, 1453, a great council was summoned, and among the high lords, the Duke of York was invited to attend. Although he was encouraged to put aside his differences with Somerset in attendance at the council, York seized his chance to bring about his downfall when the Duke of Norfolk launched a verbal attack accusing Somerset of treason for losses in France and demanding his imprisonment at York's request. The lords consented. York now stepped to the fore, but would be challenged by Queen Margaret, who in January 1454 put forth her claim to the regency. However, this was rejected outright by both Houses of Parliament before they made a concession and named Edward as Prince of Wales on the 15th of March. On the 27th of March, York was named as Protector of the Realm and Chief Counsellor during his term as Protector. York would appoint himself Captain of Calais, reclaim his lieutenancy of Ireland, and appoint some of his own allies to the council, including Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, as Chancellor. Henry finally recovered by Christmas 1454, although he had no memory of his period of illness, and straightway ordered gifts of thanks to be delivered to the shrine in Canterbury for his recovery. Henry acknowledged his son, ensuring the succession, and would quickly undo much of what York had enacted as protector. Somerset was released from the Tower and soon resumed his position within government, reclaiming the titles of Captain of Calais and Constable of England from York. The Duke of Exeter, imprisoned by York for his part in the violent feud between the Percys and Nevilles, was ordered to be released, and Salisbury was removed as Chancellor. The Protectorate was formally ended, and with York and his allies sidelined and fearing victimization, they left London and began raising an army. The initial intention by York and his allies was not to go to war, only to remove the traitors from around the king, namely Somerset and his allies. News of the approaching force prompted Henry to send a small delegation to negotiate with York, but to no avail. Henry and the court had been due to travel to Leicester for a great council on the 21st of May, but now it was decided to divert to St. Albans to gather reinforcements before proceeding to Leicester. They were still a short distance from St. Albans on the morning of the 22nd of May when news arrived that York was not far away with a larger force than their own. With this news, Henry appointed Humphrey, Duke of Buckingham, as Constable of England, a conciliatory action in the hope that York would be willing to negotiate with someone other than Somerset. The king's party continued on, but York reached St. Albans first. Negotiations began in the king's name by Buckingham and Somerset, but it seems that Henry took no part in them, in stark contrast to the way he threw himself into making peace with France years earlier. It has been said that he seemed to show signs of confusion at this time, but after only an hour, the Earl of Warwick, on the side of York, grew impatient and launched an attack on the town's barricades. Initially, the defenders held out until they were flanked by Warwick's men. Somerset and Henry Percy were killed, and Henry, still under his banner in the marketplace, was wounded in the neck but took no active part in the fighting. Henry hid in a tanner's house and was soon captured by York and taken to the abbey. He was not harmed by his captors, for York was fighting for, not against, the king. With Somerset dead, York, accompanied by Salisbury and Warwick, took Henry to the shrine in the abbey, where Henry, with little choice in the matter, swore them as his liege men. York then ordered an end to the fighting in the name of the king. Henry was returned to London the next day, and on the 24th paraded through the streets with York, Salisbury, and Warwick by his side. On the 25th, in St. Paul's Cathedral, York himself would hand Henry his crown. Henry would grant pardons to almost all who had fought alongside York in the July session of Parliament. York would briefly serve as protector of the realm again from the 19th of November. Although it has not been definitively proven, there is some suggestion that Henry was suffering from ill health at the time and was unable to attend Parliament or rule in his own right. However, York resigned the position in late February 1456, given the lack of support he received for another act of resumption that was put through Parliament, and his authority would continue to wane throughout the year. At the same time, Queen Margaret would strengthen her position, replacing some of York's men with her own in offices of stature. The court moved to Coventry with Henry in August, where he was joined by Margaret and their son in September. But by this time, he presented a somewhat feeble image. During this time, Margaret's influence would grow not only with the king, but within her appointments of men loyal to her within government and on her son's council. For now, an uneasy peace held between the Yorkists and Royalists, and Henry would march at the center of the Love Day procession in London in March 1458, an act designed to reconcile the two sides. But when Warwick fled back to Calais, after violence broke out between his men and the king's household, after being summoned to a council, the situation began to deteriorate once again throughout. 1459 hostilities began anew on the 23rd of September. 1459 with the Battle of Blue Heath, the first battle of the Wars of the Roses, where the Lancastrians were to intercept Salisbury's force. The Lancastrian forces were routed, but Salisbury's force was much depleted by the time he met with York and Warwick. The Yorkists made one last appeal to Henry by letter, to which he replied he would offer York, Warwick, and their men a pardon, excluding Salisbury, but only if they surrendered within 6 days. The two armies once again faced one another in the field at Ludford Bridge on the 12th of October, and despite rumors spread by the Yorkists that Henry was dead, he and Margaret accompanied their forces. Opening shots were fired by Yorkist artillery, but battle wasn't joined, and later that night a large number of men defected to Henry. Following this and sensing defeat, York, Salisbury, and Warwick fled, leaving their men where they stood, unaware that their commanders had deserted them. York and his second son Edmund fled to Ireland, leaving his wife and 2 younger sons behind, while Salisbury, Warwick, and York's eldest son Edward went to Calais. The next morning, leaderless, the Yorkist forces surrendered, with most receiving pardons. Queen Margaret now stepped to the fore in punishing the crown's enemies, attainting York and his associates, and giving some of their confiscated possessions. 2 trusted men of the crown, including Owen Tudor and his surviving son Jasper. But all attempts to dispose of the leading Yorkists failed, and on the 26th of June, 1460, Warwick and his men landed at Sandwich, reaching London by the 2nd of July. On the 10th of July, with the king and queen in attendance, the two sides faced one another outside Northampton, already lacking in strength. Part of the king's force defected to the Yorkists, causing many of the remaining soldiers to desert. Orders were issued that the king should not be harmed, and he was soon taken captive, while many of his lords were slain. Henry returned to London as a prisoner of Warwick, and Margaret fled, first to Wales before making her way to Scotland. In October, York returned to stake his claim for the crown by right of descent. There was much debate in Parliament, where Henry was not in attendance, and finally it was agreed that York would be named heir to the throne in place of Henry's son on the 31st of October, 1460. York and his son Edmund were killed outside Sandal Castle near Wakefield on the 30th of December, 1460, in pursuit of Queen Margaret, who still vehemently opposed them and had gathered an army to deal with the Yorkists. Salisbury's son would also die in the battle, while Salisbury himself was captured and beheaded the following day. Their heads were then put on display on the gates of the city of York. Margaret joined the army in January 1461, and they began advancing south. Warwick, taking Henry with him, went north with his force, and once again the two armies met in St. Albans on the 17th of February. The Lancastrians won the day, and Henry was recovered from the Yorkists to be reunited with his family. He was overjoyed at his release and knighted his son. Warwick had fled the field and was met on the road by York's elder son Edward, making his way to London from his own victory against Jasper Tudor at Mortimer's Cross, Herefordshire. At the same time, the Lancastrian court was also making its way to London, and would arrive first. Arrangements were made with the mayor for them to enter the city, but when they approached Cripplegate on the 22nd of February, the citizens of London barred the gates against them. In contrast, Edward was welcomed into the city on the 27th of February, cutting a much more striking and royal figure than Henry in the following days. Henry was denounced as unfit to rule, and Edward IV assumed the crown on the 4th of March, 1461. The Battle of Towton would follow at the end of March, but Henry, Margaret, and Edward were not present, having already travelled north to York. They then found refuge in Scotland, where plans were made to reclaim the kingdom. Henry still had supporters, and many would join him in Scotland, where they raided over the border a number of times. Margaret travelled to France to negotiate with the new king, Louis XI. An agreement was struck in 1462, and she returned to Scotland. But it was countered by the sealing of a truce between England and France in mid-1463. A truce was then concluded with Scotland in December 1463, which ended their refuge in the country. The Lancastrians were forced back into northern England, where they kept up resistance and would fight a number of battles, but were ultimately defeated at this point. Henry seemed to be little more than a figurehead and stayed away from the battles. Following the defeat, he went on the run, seeking shelter from his sympathizers, but was eventually caught by a group of men in Lancashire on the 13th of July, 1465, and was taken back to the Tower. By the time Henry was captured, Margaret had been in France for 2 years with her son, still seeking aid for their cause. Warwick made his way to France in 1470 after a failed uprising against Edward IV. Relations between the two had broken down, and now with aid from Louis XI, Margaret and Warwick were reconciled. Warwick agreed to betroth his daughter to Henry's son, Prince Edward of Westminster, and they married in December 1470. By this time, Edward was already the opposite of his father, with his martial nature. Warwick invaded England in the autumn of 1470, and Edward IV fled, having been deserted by many of his supporters. On the 3rd of October, 1470, Henry was once again proclaimed king, but took no hand in ruling, and was said to be extremely passive for the few short months he sat on the throne. Edward IV invaded England with a small army in March 1471, and gathered support as he marched south, with Margaret and her forces still in France. It was left to Warwick to throw back the invasion, a task at which he utterly failed, preferring instead to wait within the walls of his castle in Coventry to be reinforced. Edward IV marched on London. Henry was paraded through the streets to give heart to people at the news of the invading force, but it was said to have much the opposite effect, and Edward entered the city on the 11th of April, 1471. Henry was immediately taken into custody and returned to the Tower. Margaret, Prince Edward, and their forces landed just 3 days later, on the 14th, but their advance north was halted by Edward IV at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May. Prince Edward was killed during the battle, and Margaret was taken prisoner. Henry, still in the Tower, was killed on the 21st of May, 1471, likely on the orders of Edward IV, though not by his own hand. History has often looked on Henry VI as mad, empty-headed, or an imbecile, a reluctant ruler who was not fit to hold the crown, but powerful influences acting on him from birth led to a dependency in life that would never leave him, and in the wake of his father's death, he had no kingly example from which to learn and form the basis of his own rule, nor experience of growing up in court in any other position than king. Some historians have even suggested that Henry was merely a puppet through which others ruled. There is no evidence that Henry was frail or simple-minded, nor that he suffered any unusual ill health in his younger years, and was noted to be calm in his temperament and overtly pious. He was of a generous nature, but such was his generosity that it was of detriment to himself In a time when finances throughout the realm were stretched by war and an economic slump, this generosity also highlights the confusion he seems to have borne in matters pertaining to governance when he frequently duplicated grants. He was well-intentioned and took interest in some aspects of his rule, but seems not to have had the necessary political and diplomatic acumen that a king of the time required. Henry certainly cannot be said to have inherited his father and grandfather's militaristic tendencies, but was merciful and compassionate to a fault, issuing many pardons over the years, some of which were certainly undeserved and went against the advice of his council, his dependency on those around him, especially his wife. In the later years of his reign would intensify as he became increasingly withdrawn and possibly disillusioned with his role. This would result in much strife over many years and highlights that, despite his best intentions, his inattention and lack of interest in many matters made his rule, for the most part, ineffectual. What do you think of King Henry VI? Was he an ineffectual king who was unfit for the role, or was he a kind-natured king and a victim of circumstance? Let these gentle thoughts drift through your mind as you settle into peaceful slumber. Dear listener, tonight we've journeyed through the tragic tale of Henry VI, a man who inherited 2 kingdoms as a baby, but could never truly rule either. From his sheltered childhood under the care of regents, through his struggles with mental illness, to his eventual defeat in the Wars of the Roses, Henry's story reminds us that even crowns cannot shield us from life's deepest challenges. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that history's most troubled souls often teach us the most about compassion, understanding, and the gentle strength found in kindness. May these medieval whispers carry you softly into restful dreams, where kingdoms are peaceful and all hearts find rest. Thank you for joining us on this tranquil journey through England's most troubled kings. Sweet dreams, gentle listener, until we meet again in the realm of Sleepy Crown.